It's easy to see the Mahdi's revolt in Sudan in the early 1880s through 21st century eyes, as a nationalist war for independence. And in a way it was. The Egyptian rulers were kicked out and an independent Islamic state managed to stay aloof from the European scramble for Africa for well over a decade. But it was not merely a nationalist movement for an independent Sudan. It was an Islamic movement. The Mahdi didn't see himself as some sort of George Washington. He saw himself as God's appointed on earth, with an Islamic revivalist mission that went well beyond Sudan's borders. And whilst General Charles Gordon was dead and the British Army withdrawn from the Sudan, it was this remodelling of the Middle East that concerned the British, as it would inevitably change the status quo, not least threatening the Ottoman Empire, but would also directly threaten her interests in Egypt and the Suez Canal. And so in 1888 and 1889, nearly 4 years after the death of Charles Gordon, the British fought 2 more battles with the Mahdists. They're pretty much forgotten now, but at the time they were important. Despite being footnotes in history, these battles proved the high watermark for the Mahdist Islamic Revolution. They also marked the moment when, after the disasters of Hicks Pasha, the Egyptians proved they were willing and able to hold their own against the dervish warriors. This is the story of those last 2 battles and the British general who was forgotten for nearly 100 years. It's time to explore the battles of Suakin and Toski and General Francis Grenfell. I've told a whole series of stories about the British in Egypt and Sudan in the late 19th century, so I don't want to bore you with all the details here. Suffice to say that having failed to rescue General Charles Gordon in Khartoum, the British Army's relief expedition was quietly wound down and their troops left Sudan in 1885. Well, that's the nutshell version of history, but just like the modern world, it's a little bit more complex than that. True, the British Army had left Sudan, but they were still in neighbouring Egypt. And Egypt was the first item on the Mahdi and his successors' shopping list when it came to exporting their brand of Islam. Secondly, British Army officers held most of the senior posts within the Egyptian army, meaning that, by default, the British would have an interest in any Egyptian versus Sudanese dervish confrontation. And don't forget what a mess they ended up in when they lent Charles Gordon to the Egyptians to oversee the evacuation from Khartoum. Now, you might be wondering what on earth the British are doing supplying officers to the Egyptian army. Well, following the nationalist rising by Rabi Pasha and its subsequent suppression by the British Army under Lord Wolseley in 1882, the Egyptian army had effectively been placed under British control. The army that the British took over was a shambles, well armed with modern weapons and nice uniforms, but badly organised and completely demoralised. For those of you who've heard my story about Hicks Pasha, you'll realise just what a shambles it was. Just to get this clear, the Egyptian army was totally separate from the British army in Egypt. However, it was commanded by a British general and its senior ranks staffed by British officers. Initially, this commander, or Sirdar, was Sir Evelyn Wood, a member of Garnet Wolseley's Ashanti Ring. However, in 1885, Wood moved on to pastures new and he was replaced by General Sir Francis Grenfell. Wood and Grenfell spent the 1880s reorganising the Egyptian army, improving pay, organisation, training and morale. But by 1888, 5 years after the disaster with Hicks Pasha, the Egyptian army was untested. All 8 of the battles fought during the attempts to relieve Gordon had been fought by the British army. So here we are in 1888, 5 years after Hicks Pasha, 4 years after the death of Gordon in Khartoum, 3 years after the last British battle at Guinness. Egypt's empire in Sudan was no more. Well, actually that's not quite true. They clung on to some forts and towns just across the modern Egypt-Sudan border. They also, of a fashion, still hold the province of Equatoria down in what is nowadays South Sudan. I say of a fashion because whilst their governor, Emin Pasha, was unconquered, he was completely cut off. And I don't mean just cut off from Egypt. He was cut off with no access to the outside world. It would take a daring rescue mission to relieve Emin Pasha, and I'll tell you that story in the future. So a few forts on the border and a province that no one could get into or out of, that was Egypt's empire in Sudan. There was one other tiny possession still flying the Egyptian flag. The port of Suakin on the Red Sea coast. Those of you who have listened to some of my other stories on these British and Sudanese conflicts will probably remember the port of Suakin. The Egyptian government sent a British officer to take command of this isolated port, Colonel Herbert Kitchener. In his mid-30s, he arrived at Suakin in September 1886 with the rather grand title of Governor of the Red Sea Province. Well, in reality, his writ ran to, just beyond the town walls. From the roof of his headquarters, on which was stationed a detachment of sailors from the Naval Brigade with 3 Gatling guns, as he looked inland, everything the young governor could see was controlled by the Mahdist commander, Osman Digna. And again, some of you might remember his name. Kitchener immediately set about remodelling the town's defences. A 10-foot-high brick wall was constructed to protect Suakin, which was named, somewhat modestly, Kitchener's Wall. Along the wall, at intervals, were placed 6 forts. These defensive positions jutted out from the wall, enabling enfilade fire to be directed on attacking dervish warriors. Over the next 16 months, despite his defensive efforts, Kitchener found his position increasingly precarious, as Osman Digna's warriors effectively laid siege to Suakin. All supply routes from the interior were cut, and the water wells just outside the town began to be threatened. The wily Digna knew, just like Kitchener, that in this arid landscape, the water supply was key to the Egyptians retaining control of the port. In an effort to relieve that pressure, Kitchener took a force of armed Egyptian police in a surprise attack on Osman Digna's camp, 15 miles from the port. On the 18th of January 1888, leading his mounted men, Kitchener swept into his enemy's camp at Handub. The Battle of Handub was Kitchener's first ever time commanding in action. The young Kitchener's speed of attack had caught the dervish unawares, but that very speed of advance had also resulted in the cavalry leaving the bulk of his infantry force some miles behind. Realising the meagre size of Kitchener's force, Digna's men rallied and counter-attacked. Now forced to make a fighting retreat, Kitchener was hit by a bullet. The .43 caliber bullet shaved off a piece of his right earlobe before splintering his jaw, and that shattering impact drove a bone fragment into his throat, penetrating his windpipe and tonsils. The retreat had to be handled by his second-in-command as the stricken Kitchener desperately rode for safety. It's one of those small what-if moments in history. If Kitchener hadn't survived, would there have been a Battle of Omdurman with the results that were achieved? How about concentration camps in the Boer War? Or Your Country Needs You posters at the beginning of the First World War? All academic, as despite that injury, Kitchener was operated on and survived. Following his pointless battle, he was forced back on the defensive, constructing 2 further forts further out from the wall to protect the town's water supplies. As 1888 wore on, Osman Digna's men grew bolder and bolder. Whilst most of the Mahdist warriors relied on traditional weapons of spears and swords, a growing number had been armed with modern Remington rifles, thanks to the Mahdist successes at Khartoum and the Battle of Suakin. These rifles were now brought into play to effectively create a no-man's land between the town wall and the water forts. Each day, Kitchener's Egyptian garrison had to run the gauntlet of fire as they raced across the open ground to change the guard. As Osman Digna's forces grew in numbers and proximity, it was only a matter of time before an all-out assault on the 2 water forts took place. And if the water supply was cut off, Kitchener sent an urgent message to Cairo. The port needed to be reinforced, not simply to deny the dervish control, but to push them away from Suakin altogether. You have to hand it to Osman Digna. He was like a boxer who never accepted defeat, no matter how many times he hit the canvas. So far, his tally was a victory over Valentine Baker and his Egyptians back in 1884. And since then, he'd suffered successive defeats against the British at El Teb, Tamai, Hashin and Tofrek. And yet, here he was in 1888, still controlling the interior of the Red Sea province, and once more rallying his warriors for an attack on Suakin. Alarm bells started to ring in Cairo, and further away in London. For the Egyptians, the danger was obvious. The loss of their only foothold, or more like a toehold, on the Red Sea coast. They proposed sending a force of 4,000 of their own troops, along with 1 battalion of regular British troops stationed in Egypt. For the British, it was more about prestige. Back in 1883, an Egyptian army under British General William Hicks Pasha, had been defeated by the Mahdi. And then there was the real high-profile one, Charles Gordon's death in Khartoum. And let's not forget Valentine Baker's embarrassing defeat at the First Battle of El Teb. Young Colonel Kitchener and his Egyptian force in Suakin could not be allowed to be left dangling at the mercy of Osman Digna. Nor could or should the British rely on the Egyptians to save a British army officer, because, let's just say, when fighting the dervish, the Egyptians had form. Despite their superior weaponry, their soldiers had crumbled at both the Battle of Suakin, when Hicks Pasha had been defeated, and at that first Battle of El Teb. And despite the fact that since those days the British had taken over the Egyptian army, it was still early days, and confidence wasn't exactly high that they would stand their ground or take their fight to Osman Digna's warriors. And worse than that, if, as had been the case in the recent past, the Egyptians broke, then that solitary British battalion would probably be wiped out, along with Kitchener and Suakin. On the 4th of December 1888, in a debate in the House of Commons, Randolph Churchill, father of Winston, expressed his fears that the response was inadequate. He reminded his fellow MPs that the British had sent an inadequate force into Zululand 10 years before, and it had met with disaster. As I said just now, the British government were keen to avoid another Billy Hicks or Gordon of Khartoum embarrassment. Indeed, the death of Gordon had resulted in the fall of William Gladstone's Liberal government and ushered in the current Conservative administration under Lord Salisbury. And it was now the turn of Salisbury to be alarmed. Losing another British officer in the service of the Egyptian Khedive was bad enough. A scenario like the British disaster at Isandlwana in the Zulu War was unthinkable. It was electoral suicide. Hurriedly, his government decided to bolster the British contingent. 750 British troops drawn from the 1st Battalion, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, the 1st Battalion, the Welsh Regiment, and the 1st Battalion, Royal Ulster Rifles, were sent to Suakin to join the Egyptian brigade. The whole force would be commanded by the British commander or Sirdar of the Egyptian army, General Francis Grenfell. Grenfell came from a family whose exploits in the 19th and 20th centuries read like a CV of the British Empire. Originally Cornish tin mine owners, the family produced 5 members of Parliament, 2 generals, a Victoria Cross recipient, a war poet, an admiral in the Chilean and Brazilian navies, a governor of the Bank of England, to name just a few. One daughter married Charles Kingsley, author of The Water Babies. Sons of the family died at the Battle of Omdurman, Spienkop, and in the Matabele War in what was then Rhodesia. 4 were killed in the First World War. Francis Grenfell himself was born in 1841 and had joined the army in 1859 when he was 18. His service to date had included fighting in the 9th Xhosa War in South Africa and at the Battle of Ulundi during the Zulu War. Having fought for General Wolseley at Tel el-Kebir against Arabi Pasha, who I mentioned earlier, he was appointed aide-de-camp to Queen Victoria. In 1885 he returned to Egypt to take up the post of Sirdar of the Egyptian army. And it was Grenfell who had commanded at the Battle of Guinness, the last battle in which the British fought in their redcoats. And now, here he was in charge of a combined Egyptian-British army of nearly 5,000 men in Suakin. Just to add to Grenfell's firepower was a detachment from the Royal Naval Brigade manning their guns inside the port, and the 20th Hussars providing cavalry support. At 7 a.m. on the 20th of December 1888, General Grenfell led a sortie out of the port against the Mahdist warriors. Alongside his British contingent, the 4,000 Egyptian troops were commanded by Kitchener. Of those 4,000, nearly half were drawn from Sudan itself, as I'll explain later. The ensuing Battle of Suakin, sometimes referred to as the Battle of Gemaizah, lasted just 30 minutes. It started with the Sudanese and Egyptian troops storming the dervish trenches outside the town. The fleeing dervish warriors didn't run very far. I said earlier that Osman Digna refused to know when to lie down. Well, the same applied to his Beja warriors. These tribesmen had fought for their mountainous homeland against all comers for centuries. Valentine Baker and his Egyptians, the Ottoman Turks, the Portuguese, way back to the Roman legions. Sometimes it took some time, but they always saw them off. They weren't frightened of General Grenfell and his British troops, let alone these Egyptians in front of them. They knew that when they charged, the Egyptians would flee. The Egyptians had form. And so now the Beja reformed their lines, ready to charge. And indeed, seeing them, the Egyptian units climbing out of those trenches hesitated. Interestingly, it was the actual Egyptians who hesitated. The Sudanese regiments held their nerve. Many probably had a score to settle with the Mahdists, as again I'll tell you later. Grenfell wasn't taking any chances. He ordered the Welsh Regiment and the King's Own Scottish Borderers forward. Coolly, the British regulars laid down a withering volley fire. The attempted charge by the Beja ground to a standstill, and now the Bluejackets of the Naval Brigade opened up from the town walls with their Gatling machine and heavy guns. It was totally one-sided. Bravery of Beja warriors fighting an almost medieval battle versus the might of an industrial nation. Years later, this one-sided style of battle would be repeated at Omdurman on an even larger scale. Whilst the Battle of Suakin, aka Gemaizah, was on a much smaller scale, the losses were just as one-sided as they would be at Omdurman. In less than half an hour, Osman Digna lost over 1,000 men. Grenfell's British, Egyptian, Sudanese army lost a handful. Not a single British officer was killed or wounded, which, if you listen to my other stories from this campaign, says it all. Indeed, the battle was so one-sided that it resulted in a debate in the British Parliament. Randall Cremer, the Liberal MP for Shoreditch Haggerston, asked if the government would take steps to prevent further examples of what he called, quote, this system of scientific slaughter, unquote. The government's response was to state that his question was an insult to Her Majesty's troops, and batted it away. In the same debate, concern was raised that 3 of the Hussars' swords had broken when they had finally charged to clear the field of the remaining Dervish warriors. Despite this concern being raised by a government-supporting Conservative, it was once more brushed under the carpet. With Suakin secure, Grenfell was ordered to return with the British troops to Egypt and leave Kitchener in command of a sizable Egyptian-Sudanese garrison. Herbert Kitchener would remain governor of the Red Sea province, for what it was worth, until the following year, when he would become Adjutant General of the Egyptian army. The Battle of Suakin was the first time since the fall of Khartoum that infantry battalions of the reorganised Egyptian army had gone into action against Mahdist warriors. And despite that initial wobble, they had acquitted themselves well. Their commander, the Sirdar, General Grenfell, could feel pleased with their performance. Which is just as well, because the next time they'd face the Mahdists, they would do it without almost any British support. Apart from their British officers and a cavalry squadron, they would be on their own when the Mahdist army invaded Egypt itself. Stay with me as we travel to the Battle of Toski. The self-proclaimed Mahdi had died shortly after the fall of Khartoum and the death of General Charles Gordon in 1885. His successor was his key supporter, Abdullahi ibn Muhammad, known as the Khalifa. The Khalifa was on a mission to continue the Mahdi's work of spreading his form of militant Islam across the Muslim world. As part of his end-of-days message, all non-believers deserved to be put to the sword, but equally, so would all Muslims who didn't buy the Mahdist brand of Islam, such as the Egyptians, for instance. He believed that Egypt needed to hear the true message and conform, and if that meant conform by the power of the sword, so be it. In late summer 1889, he ordered one of his trusted commanders, Emir Wad el-Nujumi, to invade Egypt. The Dervish army, numbering 6,000, managed to bypass the Egyptian garrison at Wadi Halfa. It then followed the Nile almost 45 miles north of the border into Egypt, not far from Abu Simbel. The Sirdar, General Francis Grenfell, was ordered by the Egyptian Khedive to counter this invasion. He rapidly moved south with an almost entirely Egyptian army. Apart from the Sirdar himself, the only British in this army were the officers in the Egyptian regiments and a squadron of the 20th Hussars. The same 20th Hussars whose swords had broken at the Battle of Suakin the previous year. His army consisted of 6 battalions of infantry, 4 cavalry squadrons, 1 camel regiment and 2 artillery batteries, not forgetting those British Hussars. It was a massive commitment by the Egyptians. Grenfell's force made up about a third of the entire Egyptian army. The Egyptian cavalry were commanded by Kitchener, who had left the joys of Suakin to take up the post of Adjutant General in the Egyptian army, reporting to Grenfell. Of the 6 infantry battalions, 4 were made up of Sudanese troops. It's time to explain how they fit into this story. Most of these soldiers came from what is now South Sudan, and many were former slaves. They had no truck with the strict Quranic message of the Mahdists, including the ownership of slaves. These Sudanese had already proved their mettle at the Battle of Suakin, and they were to earn the respect of British troops over the coming years, not least at the battles of Atbara and Omdurman in the 1890s. But those battles are for the future. The Sudanese battalions also had the advantage of being commanded by a soldier's soldier. Hector MacDonald, the son of a crofter in the Scottish Highlands, had risen from the ranks and would ultimately become a general. Known as Fighting Mac, he was almost the polar opposite to Kitchener when it came to combat. No scientific warfare, just a straightforward fighter. And sometimes you need that sort of commander. On the 3rd of August, 1889, Grenfell scouts located the Mahdist camp near Toski, sometimes called Toski. Waiting for his infantry to catch up, Grenfell now ordered Kitchener to take the cavalry forward and lure the dervish out of their camp. He wanted them in the open. The arrival of Kitchener's mounted troops on the horizon had the desired effect. Rather like a beehive that's been disturbed, the Sudanese warriors swarmed out onto the sandy terrain. Slowly the cavalry fell back, bringing the entire dervish army with them. Indeed, seeing the Egyptians fleeing was exactly what most of these Mahdist warriors expected. They hadn't been with Osman Digna on the Red Sea coast. They still thought the Egyptians ran from Sudanese warriors. And so they came on. Kitchener's cat-and-mouse tactics gave Grenfell time to position his infantry and artillery. For a full 6 miles, the dervish chased the cavalry. Just to the northwest of Toski, the desert rises away from the west bank of the River Nile. And it was here, on the elevated ground in his favour, that Grenfell lined up his men. The dervish army came into sight, the sun glinting on the thousands of their spear points, flags billowing in a gentle breeze. Some of the dervish warriors were dressed in chainmail. It was like something out of a medieval battle. And as they came on, with horns blowing, there must have been more than a few Egyptian soldiers who wondered if their British commander had made a terrible mistake. With a roar, the dervish army now charged. With the same fanatical courage that had destroyed Hicks Pasha and his 10,000-strong Egyptian army just 6 years before, they came on. Grenfell ordered his infantry and artillery to fire. They fired, and then this new Egyptian army didn't run away. They stood there and delivered volley after trained volley. But still the dervish came. Finally, in front of the 13th Sudanese Battalion, one of Fighting Mac's battalions, the Mahdist attack stalled, and they started to fall back. But not a flight. This was a well-ordered retreat. The dervish warriors now reformed a new line, ready to charge again. They were incredible. MacDonald ordered his Sudanese battalions to continue their volley fire. The charge never came. The dervish warriors, brave and fearless, could not work out how to cover that killing ground. And finally, Hector MacDonald ordered his men to fix bayonets. And now it's the turn of the dervish warriors to be on the receiving end of a charge. Finally, they'd had enough and turned. If the first retreat had been well ordered, this was anything but. It was a rout. Kitchener led the Egyptian cavalry and the 20th Hussars charging into the fleeing army. And as Kitchener's cavalry spread through the dervish ranks, they came across a camel surrounded by 40 warriors. The cavalry opened fire, and all but one of the warriors fell where they stood. Upon closer inspection of the camel, which amazingly had survived, Kitchener found the body of the emir, along with his 5-year-old son. His warriors had died protecting him, like a medieval bodyguard. The Battle of Toski had lasted 7 long hours. Of the 6,000 Mahdist army, only 800 got away. 1,200 were killed, but approximately 4,000 had surrendered. The Egyptian army had lost just 25 men killed and 140 wounded. It was an emphatic victory. A victory that had not needed regular British troops, apart from the Hussars charging alongside the Egyptian cavalry at the end. Following from the success of Suakin the previous year, the message to the Khalifa down in Omdurman was clear. The Egyptians were now a match for his army. More worrying for the Khalifa was not the defeat of his army or the loss of his commander, the emir. It was that the majority of his army had surrendered, and that was a worrying sign that he didn't carry the authority of his mentor, the Mahdi. The Battle of Toski, or Toski, was the high watermark for the Mahdist revolution. While Sudan remained independent, the Khalifa would never again attempt to invade Egypt. Already facing internal dissent and an invasion by the Abyssinians, Ethiopians, the defeat at Toski drove the Khalifa to becoming increasingly paranoid and despotic. He managed to remain in power for another 9 years. And 9 years later, it would be a joint British and Egyptian army that would defeat his forces at the Battle of Omdurman. And once more, at that battle, the Sudanese battalions of the Egyptian army would be present. And once more, they would be commanded by Hector MacDonald, Fighting Mac. By then, General Grenfell had moved on. He left his position as Sirdar of the Egyptian army in 1892, with Egypt secure. His replacement, and the man who would command at the Battle of Omdurman? Herbert Kitchener. And as for General Grenfell, this British soldier, who ultimately became a field marshal, has been largely forgotten. But at the time he was lionised. He was so admired in Victorian and Edwardian Britain that a road in Kensington was renamed after him. And in the 1970s, a tower block was built nearby and the road lent its name to it. Grenfell Towers. Join me next time as I share with you the story of the towering General Grenfell and his wider family. Omdurman, Spienkop, the Easter Rising in Dublin, Victoria Crosses, war poets, South American revolutionaries. You really couldn't make it up. Thanks for joining me today. And if you enjoy my work, then why not join my supporters club, where you can get my free British history timeline as well as my weekly newsletter. There's also an opportunity to join my monthly live history discussions, where we go behind the scenes of some of my stories. A link's appearing in a moment, as well as in the description. Plenty more stories coming your way, but in the meantime, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.